In this video, I'll bring you along as we fabricate and install a mantle, 4 shelves, and 2 countertops for a new customer. This is the inspiration photo they sent me, only they expressed they wanted a lumber that's lighter in color. I'd say we hit the mark. What do you think? The first thing I did was make a cut list. Next, I can start breaking down my plywood. My first cut is to clean up this outside edge. Now I can start making rips. I'm using a 40-tooth blade and there was no tear out at all on the rips. I separated this chunk from the sheet because it'll give me my top, bottom, face and sides of the mantle. I separated the rips in a way that you wouldn't see any of the seams of the veneer. So these thin rips were put to the side. I cut a 45.5 degree angle on all the mitered edges. This piece on marking is the face of the mantle. I'll get the right side off the far end and the left side off the near end, and I'll cut them in a way that the grain flows around that mitered corner for a waterfall effect. It's important to tape all of your cross cuts because I was getting a good amount of tear out and I had to redo a few of these cuts. Want to see what's in my pocket? I taped the top, bottom, and face of the mantle together so I could cut them all to exactly the same size, with the same 45.5 degree bevel on all of them. The only edges that don't get a bevel are the back edges. This white oak is looking really good. I'm very excited about it. I cut the pieces to length first, then I put the bevel on the edge. It takes 2 passes, but it puts less resistance on the saw, and it makes a cleaner cut. I'm using this busted DeWalt sander as a weight because I can't get clamps on that far end. I'm using filament tape, otherwise known as strapping tape. It's basically packing tape with fiberglass reinforcement. It's a bit stretchier and stronger than packing tape. This sander was given to me, and it's a lemon. It can't hold the belt on the track properly, and instead of recalling it, they just stopped producing this model. It's an awful and expensive failure of a product, and DeWalt's response to the product is even worse than the product itself. It's basically a 25-pound paperweight. Time to fold some miters. Very carefully flip your pieces over. And check that those corners come together nicely. Before proceeding, make sure your left and right sides fit on nicely as well.
Today, Junior?
When my glue gets gummed up, I just yank the top off and scrape the dried glue out with a cleaning pick. I'll leave links in the description to all the products and tools I use in this video. It's all the same cost as if you were to buy it on your own, and it's a great way to support the channel. Thank you. There's actually Type-On 2 inside of that glue applicator. I cut these blocks a 32nd of an inch less than the size of the inside of my mantle. Always wiping glue on my pants. That's what designated work pants are for. A little super glue and activator on each end will clamp the blocks in place while that wood glue sets. My mantle will slide over a bracket made of 2x4s, so make your blocks short enough that they won't get in the way. I need a full 1.5 inch space in the back of the mantle to slide over that cleat. I set my block in from the edge just enough to not get in the way. Looks like about 1/8 of an inch. I set a block on each end, one in the middle, then another in the middle of each of those middles. 5 blocks total did the trick. You'll always see me with earplugs or earmuffs. Tinnitus will creep up on you sooner than you want it to, and there really is no curing it. It will only get worse over time. I put glue on the edges of every single one of these blocks. I'm using Type On 3 for a longer wet time. This gives me more time to get everything set up. You don't want to put too much glue in those miters, or it will make a mess if it seeps through that filament tape. Once all my miters have enough glue, I put super glue on the middle block only. Then I use a little bit of activator to clamp it in place. Not putting super glue on the ends will give me the flexibility to get my side pieces attached properly. I just wanted to take a second to say thank you for watching. I know you get tired of hearing it, but if you like my videos, click that subscribe button. We're always doing something different with every project. I got a bunch of exciting videos in the hopper, and you don't want to miss them. I put plenty of super glue up the sides because too much is never enough. I got more glue on those edges so the sides can go on, and pre-cut some tape that will hold it all in place. I put some super glue and activator on those inside corners so it wouldn't move at all. Then use some filament tape for some clamping pressure. That middle finger was still really tender, so I was very careful to keep it well out of the way. Now I can reinforce the rest of those blocks with super glue and activator. Some people like to use a pin nailer here, but I don't have one. When it comes to super glue, I say more is more. I love super glue. I mean, who needs clamps when you have super glue? There is wood glue on every one of those blocks, but wood glue does need clamping pressure in order to make a good bond. It doesn't need to be perfectly square, but it's always a bonus when things go together really nicely. You want to pull the filament tape and fill these cracks before the glue has a chance to fully harden. If you're using a lumber that's light in color, like this white oak, I recommend using Type On 2 for this. If you're using lumbers darker in color, like maybe a walnut, use Type On 3. I'm using 400 grit sandpaper, and what's happening is the dust is mixing with the glue and making a color matched putty to fill those voids. It also hardens up the edges and protects them from chipping. I did this down the full length of all my edges of all my components, whether there were gaps or not. It fortifies that edge. This void here was the biggest gap I had to deal with, and after filling, it looked really nice. You couldn't tell there was any gap at all, even after the finish went on it. I sanded the edges with 220 grit until all the glue was gone from the wood grain. This is a veneer plywood. I would test on a scrap piece first. I was really surprised how durable the veneer was. I didn't even bust through the veneer on my scrap piece, and I was trying to. I used mineral spirits to identify where any glue had been left behind in the wood grain. The mineral spirits dries quickly and won't damage your wood. Next, I'm making floating shelves. My floating shelves will be nested between two walls in a nook, so I won't need the side pieces, just the top, bottom, and face. These were much easier to make than the mantle. I made my shelves and countertops a few inches longer than they needed to be, so I could cut them down to size perfectly on site and scribe them in. This is a bit more of the same, so I'm going to rush through it, but I'll show you how everything comes together. It's important not to make your blocks too long here. These shelves will slide over a 3/4 inch cleat on the wall, and I don't want my blocks to hit the cleat. I went with Type-On 2 on the shelves because I knew I could get them done before the glue started to set. I made sure to pull any excess glue out of that miter using my brush. And at the end, all of my components got a light sanding with 220 grit on the random orbit sander. You don't want to go too high with the grits or it closes off the grain and won't absorb finish properly. I sprayed every piece down with air. You can use a vacuum also. Then I'm wiping the remaining dust off with mineral spirits. I'm doing all of this inside my apartment because there's way too much dust in my garage to get a decent finish. I opened a few windows and turned on the ceiling fan to properly ventilate the room. Dachshunds are the most curious and nosy creatures in all of the animal kingdom, but she's cute as a button, so I'll let it slide. I'm using Rubio Monocoat 5% white. I think the mixing ratio is 3:1. It says on the can, but this stuff is super easy to apply. This is the accelerant. It makes it cure in around 6 or 7 days instead of 20 or so. I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. I'm basically always listening to something. My absolute favorite all-time book is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. It has to be the version narrated by Pressfield, or it's not the same. Rogan would hand copies of this book out to every one of his guests, and I got so sick of hearing about it that I finally listened to it for myself. It's only 3.5 hours long. I've listened to it over a dozen times, and it really has changed my life. In this video's description, I have a link to a free 30-day trial to Audible. It comes with a credit for 1 free book, and if you don't like it, if you cancel before 30 days, you won't be charged anything. I use Audible every single day, and it would support the channel at no additional cost to you if you use my link. Thanks again. This finish is super easy to apply. Just pour it on, squeegee it around with one of these application cards, let it sit for a few minutes, and then wipe it off. It's that simple. If you can't find one of these application cards, you can pick up plastic spackle knives from almost any hardware store. I found that depositing a line of finish towards the edges then rubbing it in with my gloves was the easiest way to get the corners done and not make a mess. You can also use lint-free rags, but the rags will absorb some of the finish, and this stuff isn't cheap. The squeegees don't absorb anything at all, and it makes the finish go further. I was able to kind of wring the excess finish back into the cup. While letting the Rubio sit on one component, I spread it around on another component. This kept my workflow efficient. Once I realized I could wring the finish back into the cup, I was a lot more liberal with how much I poured on each component. After letting it sit for a few minutes, I wiped it all dry with a somewhat clean, lint-free rag. You just want to wipe up all the excess finish. If you leave any spots, it will end up drying and looking like a spot of paint on your shelf. I let all of my components dry overnight, and I installed them the next day. Now it's time to make my bracket for the mantle. I'm ripping down this 2x4 in 2 passes and flipping the 2x4 between passes. It's safer this way and puts less stress on my low-power table saw. Meow. She's one fast little doggy. It's important that the cantilever parts of your bracket are cut square, otherwise the mantle won't sit right and it won't align properly. It was easiest for me to do this on my table saw sled, and I clamped a stop block to make sure all my pieces are the same size. I'm using a combination of glue and these Craig XL pocket screws to hold everything in place. A little bit of tight bond too. And you know I love super glue and activator. Sometimes I glue my fingers to the workpiece. When attaching your cantilevers to the bracket, make sure they aren't interfering with the blocks inside your mantle. These are the Craig XL 2.5-inch screws. Sometimes when sending in those pocket screws, it makes the workpiece move, so I use plenty of glue to clamp everything in place. Alright, it's installation day. I started by finding the center on the wall, finding the center on my bracket, and marking the studs on the wall lightly with pencil. Don't use marker, it can bleed through the paint. I tack the bracket to the wall using 18 gauge nails. Once I'm happy with everything, I pre-drill and send in these head lock leg screws. They're structural wood screws with a flat head. I'll put a link to these in the description. Just doing a bit of a dry fit, test fit. Now I'm checking for level. On both sides, it was showing that the mantle was sagging slightly, so I pulled the mantle off and barely stuck some shims in that bottom edge. Once I was happy with the fit, I sent a second leg through each stud on the bottom side of my bracket. There's a slight bow in this wall, which happens. It's pretty normal, especially with the state of 2x4s these days. You can't expect any walls to be perfect. I threw some blue tape around all 4 sides of that back edge. Then I carefully scribed the profile of the wall onto my mantle. Leave your cantilevers on your bracket short enough that you have enough room for this scribing to happen. I marked inside the mantle which side's the bottom and which side is the top. If you don't have a track saw, that's fine. This line is curved anyway. I'm just cutting away the bulk to get close to my pencil mark. I cut the top. I flipped it over. Cut the bottom. This is a curved line, so I did it in 2 passes. Then I had to get creative to cut the sides. I do have a kneeling pad under the mantle. I would never put that beautiful white oak on the driveway. That would be a sin. This cut was a little scary, but it got the job done. Flipped it over and did the same to the other side. Trying to sand the 3/4 plywood with my random orbit sander would take forever. So I put a slight bevel on the inside edge of the mantle to make finessing up to that pencil line with the orbit sander go more quickly. Here I'm just creeping right up to that pencil mark. Then I cleaned all the dust off with my leaf blower before taking it back inside my customer's house. Alright, drum roll please.
It's a beaut, Clog. It's a beaut.
I'm really happy with this fit. Time to lock it in place. I pre-drilled and put 2 trim head cabinet screws in each end. The star of the show is now complete, and now we can get these floating shelves and countertops installed. I started by laying everything out nice and level. I wanted my bottom shelf to align with the top of the mantle. The wall on the left and on the back are plaster walls, and they were very rough. And by rough, I mean not square, not straight, but what can you expect from old plaster? I tacked my cleats on the wall with 18 gauge nails, then pre-drilled and screwed them in with drywall screws. My camera had died on me and I didn't notice, so I missed a little bit of screwing in those cleats, but you get the idea. This was kind of a nightmare. You can see the shape of the wall gets wider as it goes deeper. My shelves can only slide in from front to back, and with a wall on my left and my right, there was no way to mimic that shape perfectly. If you have the liberty of building that wall on the left side yourself, make sure it's square to the front of your cabinets. Or even if the gap was on the front edge, I could still have mimicked that shape and slid my piece into place. But again, I did the best I could with what I had. I measured a 1-inch overhang to the front of my template, then taped the rest of those pieces to create a template that's a replica of the space. Now I can transfer the shape onto my countertop. I'll rescribe the back edge for a better fit once I slide the counter back into place. Same deal, I cut the bulk away with my track saw, then finessed to my pencil mark with the sander. Here I took 2 passes because it is 1.5 inches thick. I've been eyeballing a track saw for years now, and I must say, it's one of the best purchases I've ever made. I should have gotten one a lot sooner. With the power of editing, my countertop slid into place perfectly on the first try, and I wasn't frustrated at all. I ripped my template down and started on my shelves. It's more of the same. Instead of using other pieces of MDF to replicate the shape, I just used blue tape. The plywood on the back wall is attached right to the plaster, and you can see it's kind of a mess. It's all over the place, but I did the best I could. It's important that the face of the shelves align with the face of the cabinets. Sorry for the butt cam here. It was a pretty tight space with a wall directly to my left. After cutting my shelf down and scribing the edges, it slid right over those cleats like a glove. Could you please get out of the way? There's a light going on the wall above this top shelf, so the customer and I agreed the top shelf should be 8 inches deep and the bottom shelf 10 inches deep. And our job here is done. Time to turn this living room over to the contractor and let him finish. I can't wait to come back and get some finished pictures.